Okay, so I'm going to demo how to get up and running with Firebase, and what we're going to do is show the quickest way to start using Firebase from the browser console. And the reason you might want to do that is that it allows us to prototype really basic JavaScript applications that interact with a cloud database right from the browser console without having to build a UI with HTML and CSS. So it's a super quick way to just start prototyping. So let's jump right in. So in the Firebase console, we can create a new project, and we'll name our project Firebase Demo. And we can turn off analytics. We don't need it for this project. So it's just going to do some thinking here and generate our new project. And once that's finished, here we are in our Firebase console. And what we want to do is we need to first create a new real-time database. So let's go over to this tab here and click Create Database. Choose whatever region is closest to you. Click Next. And we're going to start this in test mode just so we can start playing with it without worrying too much about security rules. And so here's our Firebase real-time database, and you can see there's nothing in it yet, and that's fine. What we need to do next is go to Project Settings, and we need to select a platform. So for us, we're going to use the web, and we'll just call this Firebase Demo. I don't need Firebase hosting. Click Register App. And we're not going to use NPM. We're just going to continue to console here. But here it gives us this configuration section. And we're going to use this CDN option. If we were to use NPM, we would have to use a module bundler like Webpack, and that adds a bit of complexity. We just want to get up and running as quickly as possible. So to do that, we'll select the CDN option. We actually don't need these script tags here, but this code is going to be really useful for us. So you can see, since we've created a database in the previous step, we have this line for our database URL. That's good. But we'll pause here on the Firebase console, and from here we'll set up our JavaScript app in Visual Studio Code. So here's VS Code. I have a folder open called Firebase Demo, which is on my desktop. You can put it anywhere you want. And we'll start off by creating a new index.html file. And to get some boilerplate here, we can type the exclamation mark and press tab. And we'll just rename the document to Firebase Demo, save it. And then we'll create a new file called index.js, and we need to import this this file in our HTML file. So we can do that with script tag, and we need to set the type to module so that we can use some of the import statements that we'll need, and I'll show what that looks like on the next step. And we'll set the source to index.js here. Okay, so we're importing our index.js file, and let's go into that file. And here we'll start using the code that Firebase gave us. Remember, we don't need the script tags. We'll just grab everything that's inside of the script tags, copy, go back here and paste. So you can see it's doing a few things. It's importing this initialize app function from this URL. And actually it's telling us that we can add SDKs for Firebase products we want to use here, and the one we want to use is the database. So to do that, we're going to need, to interact with the database, we need a few functions. So we're going to import a bunch of functions from a URL that looks very similar to this one, so we'll just copy it. But rather than Firebase app, it's from Firebase database. That's kind of the pattern with these CDN URLs. And the functions we're going to need just to write and then later get that data from our database are get database and ref, get, set, and child. So we import these. Here's our Firebase config object, and then we're calling this initialize app function and passing in our Firebase config. And so we'll save this. And what we need to do next is we need to be able to serve this locally so we can interact with it from our browser. And actually there's a really simple npm package called serve from Vercel, and basically this allows you to run a really quick local server, and you do that by just running npx serve from the project's directory. So let's do that. Here we are in our project directory. Super simple. We just type npx serve, press enter, and now we have a server that we can access at localhost 3000, and it's that address is already copied to our clipboard. So let's go to our browser, open a new tab, hit paste, visit this page. You can see the title is Firebase demo, which we set up in the HTML, so that tells us this stuff is really working. But let's see here. So we've imported these functions. Let's see if we have access to these in our browser. Let's, for example, try set. So if we type set and press enter, set is not defined. So we have no access to these functions yet. But we can fix that. And the way we fix that is that in JavaScript, in the browser, there's this object called window. And you can see here, if we type window in the console, we get this object with all kinds of stuff. And these are all kind of global variables that we can access. And so for the sake of prototyping, we can just attach our functions to the window object. So what we'll do is we'll just say window dot Firebase. We'll kind of keep all these functions inside of this Firebase object, so that makes it easy for us later. We can just access everything through window.firebase. And let's just actually copy all of this from the import and paste it here. And remember, when we see objects with this notation where the comma just comes directly after these here, that's equivalent to writing it like this, where, you know, here's the key, here's the value, and if those things are identical, then we can just leave off the value and write it like this. It's just a JavaScript shorthand. Okay, so we've attached these to the window. Let's save this. Control C in our terminal to close down our server, and then we'll restart it. Go back to our browser, and let's refresh. And let's see if we have access to window.firebase. And there's our object. So you can see all the functions we attached to it. And actually, since everything on window is a global object, we can save ourselves a bit of typing. When we want to access this Firebase stuff, we can just type Firebase, and that's equivalent to typing window.firebase. So it's exactly the same. Okay, so that's great. We have access to some of this Firebase functionality. Now we can see if we can start interacting with this from the console. Let's see if we can actually write data to our real-time database, which you can see here is still empty. So to do that, let's create a function, and we'll call it write user data. It'll take in 2 arguments, a user ID and a name. And inside the function, we're gonna first get our database with this get database function that we attach to window. And then again, in our Firebase object that we created, we have this set function. And we use that like this. So here's a reference to the database where we pass in first the database and then the path that we are interested in, which for us is users, plus the user ID, which we take into the function here. And then we pass the object that has the data we wanna set. So username, and we set that to the name that gets passed in. Okay, hit enter, and we've saved our function called write user data, and let's see if we can use it. So to use it, we type write user data with the parentheses at the end here, and then we'll set the user ID to 1, and we'll set the name to Jacob, press enter, and no errors, so that's good. Let's see if this data made it safely into our database. Here you can see now we have this user's path. If I click in here, we see a user ID of 1, and there's a username set to Jacob. So everything's working. We're able to, from our browser console, store data in the cloud, which is really handy. So okay, great. We can post data to our database in the cloud. Now, how do we get that data back if we want to use it later? Well, we can create a new function, and we'll call this one get user data. And we need to make this an async function, because when we ask the Firebase database for our data back, it's going to take some time, and so it returns a promise. So we need to set this function to async. We'll call it get user data. It'll take in a user ID. And first, we need to get a reference to our database. So again, let's go into our Firebase object that we've put on the window and use our ref function. And then again, we go into our Firebase object and use our get database function. And this will give us a reference to our database. And we're going to create a variable called user, and we'll use that to kind of capture the results of this Firebase get function. And the get function will take this kind of child node of our database using this child function, and we pass in our database reference, and then we pass in a string representing the path that we're looking for. And for us, we can use the user ID that we're passing in here. And this will return a promise, so then we can use this then, and This will give us a snapshot of our data. And we can return snapshot.val. Sorry, we're getting ahead of ourselves. Actually, we need to first check that this snapshot exists like this. And if it does exist, then we can return snapshot.val. Else, so if it doesn't exist, then we can console.log the error. And then at the bottom here, remember we've captured this value at user, and we can return our user. So here's our function. It's called getUserData. It takes in an argument, user ID. Then we get a reference to our database with firebase.ref, firebase.getDatabase. We capture that reference here, which we'll use later. We create a user variable, and we are using this to capture the result of, so we say await firebase.get, firebase.child, and then we pass in our database reference, the path to the information we're looking for, and then we run this then where we have our snapshot, and we check to make sure that snapshot actually exists, and if it does, we return the snapshot's value, and if it doesn't exist, then we return an error. Remember that all gets captured in this user variable, and then we return user. Okay, so we save this function. Let's see if we can actually use this function. So we just pass in the user ID, remember, user ID of 1, press enter, and it returns a promise. So that's kind of not what we want. Remember, since this is returning a promise, if we want the actual value rather than the promise, we can say await getUserData. And there is the data we're looking for. So from the console, we're able to read and write data from our Firebase database. Really nice to be able to put information into the cloud and get it later just from our console without building any UI. And this is a really handy way to just prototype the basic functionality of a JavaScript app. But actually, we can make this a bit simpler. So rather than having to kind of tediously define these functions in our console, which these will kind of disappear if we go to a new tab or whatever, we can just move these inside of our JavaScript file. So to do that, let's actually just copy this function, writeUserData, go to our JavaScript file, and down here, after we initialize the app, let's just paste this in. But remember, we no longer need this Firebase dot before everything, since these functions like getDatabase, remember, they're already imported at the top here. So if we use our cursor to select Firebase dot, and then we press Command D, it will highlight all the instances of that, and I can press delete and remove those. And let's do the same for our other function, which is getUserData. Copy it, paste it into our file, and find all these instances of Firebase dot, and delete them. Okay, so now these functions are in our JavaScript file, And we no longer need to attach all of these functions to the window because we're just using them internally in our JavaScript file, and it would be a better API in our browser if we could just use these kind of application-specific functions like write user data and get user data. So we can delete this window.firebase, and instead we can say copy this, so window.write user data equals write user data, and window.get user data equals get user data. And in a production application, you might not want to kind of muddy up the global namespace like this, but for the sake of just quickly prototyping something, this works just fine. We can save this, go into our terminal window here, press Control-C to shut down our server, and then restart it. Go back to our browser and refresh the page. And now let's see what's changed. So remember, we used to have this Firebase global variable, and if we press enter now, you can see Firebase is not defined. So that's actually a good thing. That means our changes are in effect. And instead of accessing Firebase, now we have get user data as a global variable. You can see there's our function, and we can go ahead and use this get user data, get user with the ID of 1. Oh, and that returns the promise. So remember, we have to await the result of that. And there it returns the data we're looking for. And let's test our other function, which is write user data. So this user will be ID of number 2, and set the name to Bob. Nothing really seems to happen in the console, but if we go to our database, you can see here we have a user at user ID number 1 with the username Bob. So now we're able to really easily interact with a database in the cloud from our browser console using these custom functions that we wrote for our specific application. So that's it.